At graduation, they gave my sister $250,000 for a startup, and I got a budgeting book. I returned it. When they saw the printout of my $5 million account inside, they turned pale. I never thought a cheap paperback book would be the grenade that blew up my entire family. To be perfectly honest, I never thought I would be the one to pull the pin either. But life has a funny way of pushing you exactly to the edge of what you can tolerate, and then giving you a tiny, ridiculous push over the cliff. My name is Riley. I am 22 years old, and today, I stood in my black cap and gown on the massive green lawn of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, watching hundreds of other graduates hug their crying, proud parents. The air smelled like freshly cut grass and expensive perfume. Everywhere I looked, there were flashes from cameras, bouquets of flowers being shoved into arms, and loud, joyful cheering. I stood near a large oak tree, entirely alone. My hands were stuffed deep into the pockets of my graduation gown. I did not have a bouquet. I did not have anyone taking my picture. My parents, Diana and Victor, were not there. They were roughly 200 miles away in New York, attending my twin sister Peyton's graduation from a high-end university. Peyton and I are fraternal twins, born on the exact same day, but that is literally the only thing we have ever shared. We were absolute opposites from the moment we took our first breaths. Peyton was the golden child. She was outgoing, charming, and impossibly beautiful, with a loud laugh that commanded the attention of every room she walked into. She was the star of the family, the one who always needed an audience, the one whose minor achievements were celebrated like national holidays. I was the quiet one, the introverted coder, the girl who preferred the glow of a computer monitor to the harsh lighting of high school parties. I was the invisible sister. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and looked at the screen again. There was a single text message from my mother. It did not say congratulations. It did not ask how my ceremony went. It simply read, "We are so incredibly proud of Peyton today. She looks stunning in her gown. We will figure out a time to celebrate your thing whenever you get back home." Your thing. That was how my mother, Diana, referred to my graduation from one of the most prestigious engineering schools on the entire planet. It was just a thing. A minor inconvenience on the calendar that unfortunately fell on the same weekend as Peyton getting her generic business degree. I locked my phone screen and slid it back into my pocket. A heavy, familiar ache settled in my chest, right behind my ribs. It was a dull pain, the kind of emotional bruise you get used to pressing on just to make sure it is still there. For 4 long years, I had worked myself to the absolute bone. I had pulled all-nighters until my eyes burned. I had survived entirely on cheap instant noodles and sheer spite. And on the biggest day of my academic life, no one from my family had even bothered to make an appearance. But as I stood there watching a father lift his daughter off the ground in a massive hug, I realized something important. I should not have expected anything different. Hoping for my parents to suddenly change, hoping for them to suddenly see me as equal to Peyton, was like hoping gravity would just stop working. It was foolish. It had always been this way. I took a deep breath, letting the cool Boston air fill my lungs, and turned away from the celebration. I started walking toward the subway station. I had a train to catch and a long ride home to a house where I knew I would barely be acknowledged. But I was not the same scared little girl anymore. I was walking away from MIT with a degree, a massive secret, and a plan. I just needed to survive one last family event. The train ride from Boston to Hartford took about 2.5 hours. I managed to find an empty window seat in a quiet car. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels against the tracks usually put me to sleep, but today, my mind was racing. Watching the trees blur past the window, my thoughts drifted backward, sinking into the dark, murky water of my childhood memories. The favoritism in our household was never subtle. It was not a hidden preference. It was a brightly lit billboard in our living room. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window and remembered our 16th birthday. Turning 16 is supposed to be a massive milestone in a teenager's life. I remember coming downstairs that morning, feeling a rare flutter of excitement in my stomach. When I walked into the kitchen, Victor and Diana were standing there with massive smiles on their faces. Peyton was jumping up and down, screaming. Out in the driveway sat a brand new, shiny red convertible. It had a giant white bow slapped right on the windshield. Peyton ran out the front door, screaming about how much she loved them, how she was the luckiest girl in the world. I stood in the doorway, genuinely happy for her, but waiting for my turn. Victor walked back inside, wiped some sweat from his forehead, and pointed to a heavy cardboard box sitting on the kitchen island. I walked over and opened it. Inside was a laptop. It was not new. It was a thick, clunky, heavy brick of a computer with scratches on the plastic casing. It weighed about 10 pounds and smelled like hot dust when you turned it on. I looked up at my father, confused. Victor just shrugged and offered a weak smile. He said, "Well, you do not really care about cars or going out anyway, Riley. Besides, that computer was on sale for a massive discount at the electronics store. We had to save every penny we could to put toward Peyton's convertible. You understand, right?" I just nodded. I always nodded. What else was I supposed to do? Throw a tantrum? That was Peyton's department. Then came the cake. That evening, Diana brought out a massive, 3-tier chocolate cake. The frosting was perfectly piped. In bright pink icing across the center, the words read, "Happy Sweet 16 Peyton." Not Peyton and Riley. Just Peyton. When I quietly asked my mother about it later that night in the kitchen, she did not apologize. Instead, she laughed. She used that condescending, manipulative tone she always reserved just for me. She patted my shoulder and said, "Oh, Riley, honey, do not be so sensitive. We all know it is your birthday too. We do not need to write it down to prove it. But you know how your sister gets, she loves seeing her name on things. You're the smart one, you do not need all this flashy validation." That was Diana's favorite trick. She would frame my neglect as a compliment to my intelligence. She convinced herself that because I was quiet and smart, I did not require love, attention, or basic human decency. I was expected to just exist in the background, a low-maintenance houseplant, while Peyton was the exotic orchid that required constant watering and praise. The train swayed violently as it switched tracks, snapping me out of the memory. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. I was not angry about the used laptop anymore. In fact, that clunky, heavy piece of garbage was the greatest thing my parents ever accidentally gave me. That cheap laptop became my entire world. It was my escape pod from that toxic house. Because they ignored me, I had hundreds of hours of free time. I locked myself in my bedroom, booted up that dusty machine, and taught myself how to speak the only language that made sense to me, code. While Peyton was downstairs practicing her makeup and begging for money to go to the mall, I was upstairs learning Python, C++, and Java. I built walls of code around my heart. And as the train rushed closer to Connecticut, I smiled to myself, knowing exactly where those walls had taken me. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, I was basically a ghost in my own home. I only came downstairs for meals, and even then I rarely spoke. The dinner table conversation was exclusively dedicated to Peyton's cheerleading practice, Peyton's prom dress, and Peyton's future plans. I existed purely on the margins of their lives. But I did not care anymore because I had found my sanctuary at school. His name was Mr. Callahan. He was the advisor for the high school coding club, a grumpy older man whose classroom always smelled like ozone and stale coffee. He was the very first adult in my entire life who actually looked at me and saw someone of value. I will never forget the day I walked into his lab and fixed a critical bug in a senior student's database project in less than 4 minutes. The other student had been struggling with it for 3 weeks. Mr. Callahan looked at my screen, then looked at me over the rim of his glasses. He said, "Riley, you do not just write code. You see the architecture of it. You think differently than anyone else in this school. That is incredibly valuable. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." For the first time in my life, I felt a spark of genuine pride. I used the school's faster internet and my clunky used laptop to build a massive portfolio of applications and websites. I spent months meticulously crafting my college applications, aiming for the absolute top. I applied to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I did not tell my parents. They would have just told me to be realistic and stop wasting application fees. The day the acceptance letter arrived in the mail, I intercepted it before my mother could throw it onto the junk mail pile. I took it up to my room, locked the door, and tore the envelope open. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely read the words. Not only was I accepted into the hardest computer science program in the country, but I was offered a full-ride academic scholarship. Every single penny of my tuition was covered. I walked downstairs to the living room holding the letter. Victor was reading a magazine, and Diana was online shopping for Peyton. I cleared my throat and said, I am going to MIT in the fall. I got a full scholarship. I will not need a single dollar from the college fund. I expected shock. Maybe a little bit of pride. Maybe just a hug. Instead, Victor lowered his magazine, let out a massive sigh of relief, and said, Wow, that is fantastic news, Riley. That is really great. Diana immediately clapped her hands together and turned to Victor. She said, Do you know what this means? If we do not have to pay for Riley State College, we have enough money to send Peyton to that elite private business school in New York. Oh my goodness, Peyton is going to be so thrilled. She will make such amazing connections there. Her social skills are going to shine. They did not ask what I wrote my essay about. They did not ask how hard the program was. They did not take me out to dinner to celebrate. My massive, life-changing achievement was instantly reduced to nothing more than a financial coupon they could use to fund Peyton's glamorous lifestyle. I stood in the living room for a full minute, just watching them calculate the budget for my sister's luxury dorm room. I felt something snap inside me that day. The last tiny thread of hope I had for their unconditional love just broke. I turned around, walked back upstairs, and packed my bags. I promised myself right then and there that I would never, ever rely on them for anything again. I was going to build an empire of my own, and they were not going to get a single brick of it. Life at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology was a brutal, beautiful awakening. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who spoke my language. But surviving there was not just about being smart, it was about having endurance. My academic scholarship covered my tuition and my dorm room, but it did not cover my living expenses. It did not cover food, textbooks, or the expensive server hosting fees I needed for my side projects. While my peers were going out to parties on the weekends, I was working. Because I had zero financial support from home, I took a job at the campus cafeteria. My alarm went off at 4 in the morning every single day. I would drag myself out of bed in the freezing Boston winter, put on a terrible hairnet, and scrub the industrial kitchen floors. The smell of harsh chemical bleach and stale frying oil practically seeped into my pores. My hands were constantly cracked and dry from the hot soapy water. I would finish my shift, grab a free stale bagel, and run straight to my advanced algorithms class. The contrast between my life and Peyton's life was sickening. Every few weeks, Diana would call me. She never asked if I was eating well or if I was tired. The calls were entirely dedicated to providing the Peyton News Network. She would brag loudly into the phone about how Peyton was thriving in New York. Victor and Diana were paying full tuition for her, plus paying for her luxury off-campus apartment, her clothes, and her social events. The final straw was when Diana called to tell me that they were paying for Peyton to fly to Europe for an unpaid summer internship at a fashion magazine. Peyton is going to be in Paris, Riley. Diana had shrieked into the phone. She is eating croissants near the Eiffel Tower. It is such a vital networking opportunity for her business career. What are you doing this summer? I looked down at my hands, bleeding from scrubbing grease traps, and calmly told her I was staying on campus to work. Diana just sighed and said, Well, someone has to do the hard labor, I suppose. Keep up the good work, honey. I used that anger. I channeled every ounce of frustration into my keyboard. During my sophomore year, I met Felix. Felix was a tall, incredibly awkward guy with terrible posture and a brain that worked at lightning speed. We were paired up for a group project, and we immediately clicked. We both had giant ambitions and zero social lives. We started spending every free moment in the underground computer labs. We were surviving on 99-cent ramen noodles and vending machine energy drinks. We started developing a peer-to-peer file sharing application that used a completely new method of data compression. It allowed massive files to be transferred securely in fractions of a second. We worked like maniacs. We would code until 3 in the morning, sleep on the hard couches in the student lounge for a few hours, and then I would wake up and go scrub the cafeteria floors. I was perpetually exhausted, running on fumes and adrenaline. But as the app started to take shape, we realized we had actually built something terrifyingly good. It was not just a school project anymore. It was a fully functional, revolutionary piece of software. And the tech world was about to notice. By the middle of our junior year, our file-sharing app had gained serious traction on underground developer forums. We had thousands of active users testing the beta version. Then, the emails started coming. First, it was small venture capital firms asking for introductory meetings. Then, one Tuesday morning, Felix burst into the cafeteria while I was wiping down a table. His face was pale white. He shoved his phone into my face. A massive tech conglomerate based in California had sent a direct email. They did not want to invest. They wanted to acquire the entire platform. The next 4 months were the most stressful period of my entire life. They flew us out to California. I remember sitting in a giant, glass-walled boardroom overlooking the ocean, wearing a cheap, $20 thrift store blazer that did not fit me right. The executives sitting across from us were wearing watches that cost more than my parents' entire house. They tried to intimidate us. They threw out numbers that sounded massive to a college student, but I knew the architecture of our code was worth more. The biggest problem was that we were broke. We had no money to hire a top-tier mergers and acquisitions lawyer. The tech company sent over a preliminary contract that was over 200 pages long, filled with incredibly dense legal jargon designed to confuse us and strip away our intellectual property rights. Felix panicked. He wanted to just sign it and take whatever they gave us. But I refused. I had spent my entire life being taken advantage of, and I was not going to let a bunch of guys in expensive suits do it to me now. For 3 straight weeks, I basically lived in the university law library. I checked out massive textbooks on corporate law, intellectual property, and contract negotiation. I sat there until the library closed at 2 in the morning, highlighting clauses, defining legal terms on sticky notes, and figuring out exactly how they were trying to screw us. I found 3 hidden clauses that would have locked us out of future royalties entirely. When we went back into the boardroom for the final negotiation, I did not act like a scared college kid scrubbing floors. I acted like the smartest person in the room. I pushed the contract across the massive mahogany table, pointed directly at their lead attorney, and systematically dismantled their trap. I told them we would not sign unless those clauses were removed and our buyout number was increased by 40%. The executives looked at me, then looked at each other. They knew I had caught them. The lead executive finally smiled, nodded respectfully, and agreed to my terms. We spent the next month finalizing the legal paperwork, transferring the code repositories, and holding our breath. I did not tell a single soul outside of Felix. I certainly did not tell my parents. I just waited. The deal officially closed on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sitting alone in my cramped dorm room, listening to the rain hit the window. My laptop was open on my desk, logged into my incredibly basic student checking account. The screen automatically refreshed. My breath completely left my lungs. The numbers staring back at me did not look real. It looked like a glitch in the banking software. After the corporate taxes were paid, after the legal filing fees were deducted, my personal, final cut of the sale was sitting right there in bold black font. $5 million. I was 21 years old. I had $5 million in liquid cash. I slowly reached out and touched the computer screen, tracing the numbers with my trembling index finger. I started laughing. It was not a happy laugh. It was a breathless, slightly hysterical giggle that turned into a sob. I pulled my knees up to my chest and cried for the first time in years. I cried for the girl who got the cheap used laptop. I cried for the girl who scrubbed greasy cafeteria floors at 4 in the morning. I cried because, for the first time in my entire existence, I was completely, undeniably safe. When my heart rate finally slowed down, I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over my mother's contact name. It would be so easy to press call. It would be so easy to tell them. I imagined the shock on Victor's face. I imagined Diana's screams of joy. For about 10 seconds, I fantasized about finally being the favorite daughter, the one they bragged about to their neighbors. But then, the cold, hard logic kicked in. I lowered the phone. If I told them I was a millionaire, their behavior would instantly change. They would suddenly love me. They would suddenly want to visit me. They would tell everyone how proud they were. But it would not be real. They would not be loving Riley, the quiet coder. They would be loving the $5 million attached to her. They would view me not as a daughter, but as a shiny new bank account to fund whatever wild business ideas Peyton had next. I did not want fake love. I would rather be genuinely ignored than falsely worshipped. So, I made a strict decision. I told absolutely no one. I transferred the massive sum into high-yield investment accounts and locked it down. I kept my terrible student checking account active for daily use. I continued to wear my beat-up sneakers and faded jeans. I continued to complain about the price of college textbooks. I walked around the campus like a total ghost, knowing that I possessed more wealth than most of the professors teaching my classes. It was the ultimate invisible armor. I was heading into my college graduation with total financial freedom, preparing to face my family one last time, completely unafraid of whatever neglect they threw at me. If you are enjoying this story so far, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you are living in right now. Every single comment helps push this video to more people, and I appreciate you all so much. Now let's get into the chaos. Which brings me back to the present day. Following my lonely graduation walk at MIT, and before I hopped on that train down to Hartford, I had a very important meeting to attend in Cambridge. I was done living in cramped dormitories. I was going to be starting a highly paid senior engineering job at Nexus Tech in a few weeks, and I wanted a home that reflected my actual bank account. I scheduled a viewing for a massive, 2-bedroom luxury penthouse apartment right in the heart of the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, hardwood floors, a chef's kitchen, and a private balcony overlooking the skyline. When I arrived at the building, wearing my usual faded jeans, an oversized hoodie, and my scuffed-up sneakers, the high-end real estate agent looked me up and down with obvious disgust. She actually sighed out loud when she saw me. She gave me a very rushed, condescending tour, clearly thinking I was a broke college student wasting her precious time. When we stood in the beautiful kitchen, she crossed her arms and said in a tight voice, "Well, the monthly rent is astronomical, and we require first, last, and a massive security deposit. I really do not think a student like you can afford the background check, let alone the lease." I smiled politely, pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and held it up to her perfectly powdered face. I calmly asked her, "I do not want to lease it. I want to buy the unit outright. In cash. Does this cover the asking price?" The blood instantly drained from her face. Her jaw actually dropped as she stared at the $5 million balance. Her attitude completely spun around in 1 second. Suddenly, she was offering me expensive bottled water and laughing at my jokes. I signed the preliminary paperwork right there on the kitchen island. I owned a penthouse. With that quiet victory burning warmly in my chest, I took the train down to Hartford. I took a cab from the station and finally stood in front of my childhood home. The front door was wide open, and I could hear loud music and laughter spilling out onto the lawn. I walked up the driveway. The entire front porch was covered in expensive balloon arches. Massive banners were taped to the walls reading, "Congratulations, Peyton, future CEO." There was not a single decoration with my name on it. Not one. I walked into the hallway and dropped my heavy backpack onto the floor with a loud thud. My mother, Diana, was rushing past carrying a giant tray of expensive catered appetizers. She stopped, glanced at me, and did not smile. She did not hug me. She did not say congratulations on graduating from MIT. Instead, she shoved a stack of paper napkins into my chest. "Oh, Riley, you're finally here," she snapped, sounding annoyed. "You're late. The guests are already in the living room and Peyton is doing her grand entrance soon. Take these napkins and go set them up on the buffet table in the dining room. Hurry up, do not just stand there looking messy." I looked at the napkins in my hands. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, who was treating a millionaire software engineer like unpaid catering staff at her sister's party. I did not argue. I just gave her a completely blank stare, took the napkins, and walked into the dining room. The trap was set, and they were all about to walk right into it. I stood in the dining room, smoothing out the edges of bright pink paper napkins, completely invisible in my own childhood home. The house was filling up rapidly with extended family members, neighbors, and family friends. The noise level was rising to a deafening chatter. Everyone was dressed in their Sunday best, carrying brightly wrapped gifts and expensive greeting cards. They all bypassed the dining room and headed straight for the living room, where my sister, Peyton, was holding court. She was standing in the center of the room wearing a stunning white designer dress, laughing loudly and soaking up the absolute worship of our relatives. I arranged the napkins into perfect, symmetrical little fans on the buffet table. I listened to the snippets of conversation drifting in from the other room. It was nauseating. I heard our neighbor, a woman who had known us since we were toddlers, gushing over Peyton's generic business degree as if she had just cured a major global disease. I heard my father, Victor, loudly bragging about how Peyton was going to take the corporate world by storm. Not a single person asked where I was. Not a single person noticed that the other twin, the one who had just graduated from one of the most elite engineering programs on Earth, was currently acting as the unpaid help. Well, almost nobody. I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. I turned around and saw Aunt Vivian standing there. Aunt Vivian was my father's older sister, and she was historically the only person in our entire bloodline who possessed any actual common sense. She pulled me into a tight, warm hug. It was the very first physical contact I had received all day. "Riley, it is so wonderful to see you," she said, pulling back to look at my face. "I am so incredibly sorry I could not make it up to Boston for your ceremony. It is a massive achievement. MIT. I cannot even comprehend how smart you have to be to survive there. How was it? How does it feel to be a graduate?" I smiled, feeling a genuine wave of gratitude wash over me. "It feels really good, Aunt Vivian. Thank you for asking. It was quiet, but I am proud of it." Before I could say anything else, my mother, Diana, materialized out of thin air. She had an uncanny ability to sense when attention was being diverted away from her golden child. She wedged herself between me and Aunt Vivian, holding a massive bowl of potato salad. "Oh, Vivian, you made it," Diana practically shouted, completely ignoring my conversation. "Come into the living room immediately. Peyton is telling everyone about her incredible plans for her new boutique marketing agency. You simply have to hear her vision. She is going to be a massive CEO before she turns 25. Aunt Vivian frowned, looking around the room at the decorations. She crossed her arms. "Diana, are there no decorations for Riley? She graduated today too, you know. From a school that is significantly harder to get into." The nearby conversations suddenly quieted down. A few relatives, including my completely useless cousin Nolan, looked over awkwardly. A flush of red crept up my mother's neck. She waved her hand dismissively, letting out a fake, high-pitched laugh. "Oh, do not be silly, Vivian. Of course we are celebrating both of our beautiful daughters today. Riley just arrived very late, so we have not had a chance to put up her specific signs yet. Besides, you know how Riley is. She hates a fuss. She prefers to stay in the background. Right, sweetie?" Diana looked at me with a sharp, warning glare. It was the same glare she used to give me when we were kids, silently commanding me to step back into the shadows and let Peyton shine. I did not argue. I just kept my face completely blank and nodded slowly. "Right. I hate a fuss." Victor quickly clapped his hands together from the doorway. "All right, everyone," he announced loudly, saving his wife from the awkward silence. Let us all sit down at the tables. The catered food is getting cold, and we have some very special presentations to make for our star graduate. The guests shuffled eagerly toward the tables, completely forgetting the brief, uncomfortable moment. I took a seat at the very end of the longest table, wedged next to a high school friend of Peyton's who did not even remember my name. I watched my family gather around the head of the table. The stage was set, and the main event of their delusional play was about to begin. Dinner was a loud, chaotic affair, and every single spoken word revolved around Peyton's imaginary future empire. She had not actually signed a single client, she had no portfolio, and her entire business plan seemed to consist of renting an expensive office and printing fancy business cards. Yet, our family treated her like she was the next great visionary of our generation. As the dessert plates were being cleared away, my father stood up at the head of the table. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. The sharp clinking sound immediately silenced the room. Everyone turned their attention to Victor, who was practically glowing with pride. Family and friends, Victor began, his voice booming across the dining room. Today is a monumental day. We are here to celebrate the incredible dedication, the raw talent, and the bright future of our amazing daughter, Peyton. The room erupted into applause. Peyton covered her mouth with both hands, acting perfectly shocked and humbled, even though she clearly knew this was coming. Your mother and I, Victor continued, his voice thick with emotion, have always known you were destined for absolute greatness. You have the charm, the drive, and the vision to build an empire. And as your parents, it is our greatest honor to help you lay the foundation for that empire. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. He handed it down the table to Peyton. We believe in your boutique marketing agency so much, he said, looking around the room to ensure everyone was listening to his generosity, that we went to the bank last week. We took out a second mortgage on this house to provide you with your initial seed funding. Inside that envelope is a check for $250,000. The entire dining room gasped collectively. $250,000. They had leveraged the roof over their own heads to fund a delusion. Peyton tore the envelope open, saw the check, and immediately burst into dramatic, hysterical tears. Oh my God, she screamed, jumping up to hug my father. Thank you. Thank you so much. I promise I am going to make you both so rich. This agency is going to be global. More applause. More cheering. I sat quietly at the end of the table, sipping my tap water. I felt absolutely nothing. No jealousy. No anger. Just a profound, clinical fascination at their financial stupidity. When the cheering finally died down, Victor cleared his throat again. He looked down the length of the table and finally made eye contact with me. And, of course, he added, his tone immediately dropping from grand excitement to casual obligation, we also want to acknowledge Riley. Congratulations on finishing your computer studies, kiddo. He reached under the table and pulled out a small, hastily wrapped package. The wrapping paper was wrinkled, as if it had been recycled from a previous holiday. He passed it down the table. It made its way through several hands until it was dropped unceremoniously in front of me. We thought long and hard about what to get you, Diana chimed in from the other end of the room, smiling tightly. Since you are going to be starting out at the bottom of the ladder in the tech world, we wanted to give you something practical. Something to help you manage your little entry-level salary. I reached out and carefully peeled the wrinkled paper away. The room watched in silence. I stared at the cover of the item in my hands. It was a cheap, thin paperback book. The title, printed in bright yellow block letters, read, Budgeting for Beginners. From across the table, I heard Peyton let out a sharp snicker. She quickly covered her mouth, pretending to cough, but the mockery in her eyes was unmistakable. Aunt Vivian let out a loud gasp of pure horror, staring at my parents in disbelief. I slowly ran my thumb over the glossy cover of the book. $250,000 for the Golden Child. A $10 budgeting book for the Invisible Sister. It was so perfectly poetic. I looked up, met my mother's expectant gaze, and forced the corners of my mouth into a polite smile. Thank you, I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of emotion. This is incredibly fitting. I appreciate it. I did not stay at the table much longer after the gifts were handed out. While everyone crowded around Peyton to look at the massive check and listen to her ramble about buying luxury leather office chairs, I quietly excused myself. I told Aunt Vivian I was exhausted from the train ride, gave her another hug, and slipped upstairs to my childhood bedroom. I closed the door behind me and leaned against the wood, letting out a long, slow breath. The noise of the party became a muffled hum beneath my feet. My room was exactly as I had left it 4 years ago. It was a museum of neglect. The walls were still painted a dull beige. The old, scratched desk where I had taught myself to code was sitting in the corner. The posters of tech pioneers and vintage science fiction movies were curling at the edges. This room had been my prison and my sanctuary. I walked over and tossed the paperback book onto the center of my bed. Budgeting for Beginners. I actually let out a genuine, quiet laugh. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from the high-end real estate agent in Cambridge. The message read, "Good evening, Riley. All the wire transfers have officially cleared the bank. The seller has signed the final documents. The penthouse is officially yours. I will leave the keys with the front desk concierge for whenever you arrive. Congratulations on your beautiful new home." I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. I owned a $5 million piece of real estate outright. I had zero debt. I had a massive investment portfolio. I had a senior engineering job waiting for me. And downstairs, my parents had just crippled their own financial future to buy the affection of a daughter who would bankrupt them within a year. I looked back at the cheap paperback book on the bed. Suddenly, the final piece of my mental puzzle snapped into place. For my entire life, I had stayed quiet. I had swallowed the insults, the neglect, the blatant favoritism. Even when I became a millionaire, I stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing the tiny, pathetic scraps of family connection I thought I had. But standing in that beige room, looking at the text message confirming my new reality, I realized something incredibly liberating. I did not want their connection anymore. I did not want their fake pride. I did not want to shrink myself to make them feel comfortable about their terrible parenting choices. I was done being the invisible sister. I walked over to my desk and opened my backpack. I pulled out my heavy, powerful work laptop and booted it up. The screen illuminated the dark room. I connected to the terrible house Wi-Fi, opened a secure browser, and logged directly into my primary wealth management portal. The screen loaded. There it was, sitting proudly at the top of the page. The total liquid balance, $5 million. I hit the print screen button. I opened a document editor, pasted the screenshot right into the center of a blank white page, and cropped it perfectly so the massive number and my legal name were the only things visible. I hit print and selected the clunky old wireless family printer located in the hallway study. I quietly opened my bedroom door, crept down the hall, and grabbed the warm sheet of paper off the printer tray. I brought it back into my room. I folded the paper neatly in half, perfectly creasing the edges. I walked over to the bed, picked up Budgeting for Beginners, and slid the folded printout right between the front cover and page 1. I set the book on my nightstand, packed my suitcase, and set my alarm. The era of silence was officially over. Tomorrow morning, I was going to burn the entire house of cards to the ground. The next morning, I woke up early, showered, and put on a clean pair of jeans and a simple black sweater. I grabbed the handle of my rolling suitcase, tucked the paperback book under my arm, and made my way downstairs. The house was quiet compared to the chaos of the party the night before. I walked into the kitchen. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. My parents and Peyton were already sitting around the breakfast table. They looked incredibly smug. Peyton was tapping aggressively on her expensive tablet, talking with her mouth full of toast. "I am telling you, Mom," Peyton was saying, her voice echoing in the kitchen. "If I want the agency to attract high-end corporate clients, I cannot just have normal desks. I need imported ergonomic chairs. And a massive espresso machine for the lobby. It is all about the aesthetic." People buy into the image before they buy the service. Diana nodded enthusiastically, pouring herself another cup of coffee. Absolutely, sweetie. You have to spend money to make money. That is just business 101. You are going to be so incredibly successful. I parked my suitcase by the kitchen doorway and walked over to the coffee pot. Good morning, I said casually, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. Victor looked up from his newspaper, his eyes briefly flicking down to my suitcase. Good morning, Riley. Why is your luggage packed? You just got here yesterday. We figured you would stay for the week to help your mother clean up the house after the party. I poured my coffee, taking my time. Actually, I am leaving today, I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. I have a lot of things to take care of. I am moving into my new apartment in Cambridge this afternoon. That got their attention. Peyton stopped tapping on her tablet. Diana frowned, putting her coffee cup down. What do you mean, a new apartment? Diana asked, her voice laced with immediate skepticism. You just graduated yesterday. How on earth can you afford an apartment in Cambridge? That is one of the most expensive cities in the state. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The hot liquid felt grounding. I have a job lined up, I explained calmly. I signed a contract with Nexus Tech a few months ago as a senior software engineer. I start in 2 weeks. Victor lowered his newspaper completely. Nexus Tech? He asked, raising an eyebrow. That is a massive company. Well, good for you, I suppose. But still, you need to be realistic, Riley. Even with a good entry-level tech salary, you cannot afford to live in Cambridge alone. First apartments are always shared. You will be completely broke within a month. Peyton rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. Exactly, she chimed in, using her best condescending tone. You are probably going to be living in some tiny, miserable basement with 5 other nerdy programmers. That is just how it goes when you are starting out at the bottom. You should really learn to manage your expectations, Riley. It is very naive to think you can just jump into luxury. I smiled. It was a genuine, terrifyingly calm smile. Actually, I will be living completely alone, I replied. It is a massive 2-bedroom penthouse apartment with a dedicated home office, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a private balcony. Diana let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Oh, please, Riley. Stop making things up. Entry-level jobs do not pay enough for a penthouse. You need to be extremely careful. You have no financial literacy. I placed my coffee mug down on the counter. The timing was absolutely perfect. Speaking of financial literacy, I said, my voice dropping an octave. I wanted to thank you again for the incredibly thoughtful graduation gift. I walked over to the table and placed the Budgeting for Beginners book right in the center, perfectly positioned between Victor and Diana. I tapped my index finger against the glossy yellow cover of the book. I really think you should take a look inside, I said softly. There is a very interesting lesson on page 1. It completely changed my perspective on finances. Victor let out an exasperated sigh, clearly annoyed by my tone. He reached out, grabbed the book, and flipped the front cover open. The folded piece of printer paper slipped out and fluttered down onto the wooden table. Victor put the book down and picked up the paper. He unfolded it. Diana leaned over his shoulder to look, and Peyton craned her neck across the table to see what was so important. For 3 full seconds, the kitchen was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I watched their eyes scan the black ink. I watched them read the logo of the massive wealth management firm. I watched them read my legal name at the top of the account. And then I watched their eyes hit the balance line. The physical transformation was incredible. The smug, condescending look completely melted off Victor's face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure shock. The blood instantly drained from Diana's cheeks, leaving her looking sickly pale. Peyton's eyes went so wide they looked like they were going to pop out of her skull. $5 million? Peyton practically shrieked, her voice cracking in the middle of the sentence. She snatched the paper out of Victor's hands, bringing it inches from her face. Is this some kind of sick joke? Did you print a fake document to mock me? No joke, I said, leaning casually against the counter again. That is a completely accurate screenshot of my primary Liquid account as of last night. Victor slowly looked up at me, his hands actually trembling. I do not understand, he whispered, his voice completely hollow. Where did this come from? How do you have $5 million? I crossed my arms and looked him dead in the eye. Do you remember that file sharing application I tried to tell you about last year? The one you told me to stop talking about because Peyton was explaining her cheerleading routine? My coding partner, Felix, and I sold that application to a major tech conglomerate in California. My personal cut, after all the corporate taxes and legal fees, was exactly $5 million. Diana's hand flew to her throat. She looked like she was struggling to breathe. You made $5 million from a computer program? When did this happen? The deal closed over a year ago, I confirmed, my voice as cold as ice. A year? Victor stood up from his chair, knocking it backward. You have been a multimillionaire for an entire year and you did not tell your own family? I did not flinch. If you had been even slightly interested in my life, I replied, enunciating every single word, if you had asked me one single question about my projects instead of obsessing over Peyton's delusions, you might have known. But you did not care. You never cared. The silence in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Had you ever proved your doubters wrong in the most spectacular way possible? Tell me your revenge stories in the comments below, because this next part was incredibly satisfying to watch. I watched Peyton stare at the piece of paper. The initial shock on her face was rapidly morphing into something else. Something dark, greedy, and incredibly calculating. I knew that look. It was the exact same look she had when we were kids, and she was trying to figure out how to steal my allowance. The truth was out, the bomb had exploded, and the toxic fallout was about to begin. It took exactly 10 seconds for the reality of the money to override their shame. The pivot was so fast it gave me whiplash. Peyton slammed the piece of paper down on the table. A massive, terrifyingly fake smile stretched across her face. Oh my God, Riley. She squealed, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickening sweetness that made my stomach turn. That is absolutely amazing. I always knew you were a secret genius. This is incredible news for the family. Diana immediately snapped out of her shock. She rushed around the table and tried to grab my hands. Riley, sweetie. She cried out, her eyes shining with sudden, aggressive affection. Why didn't you tell us? We are so incredibly proud of you. My brilliant daughter, a tech millionaire. We need to throw another party. We need to invite everyone back tonight and celebrate your success. I pulled my hands away from her grasp, as if her skin was burning hot. Sweetie? I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Are you proud of me, Mom? Or are you just proud of my bank account? Diana stepped back, pressing a hand to her chest, looking deeply offended. Riley, that is incredibly unfair, she said, trying to sound like a wounded victim. Of course we are proud of you. We have always loved you equally. We are a family. And since we are family, Peyton interrupted, stepping forward with that greedy look in her eyes. You know, Mom and Dad just took out that massive $250,000 loan against the house for my business. Since you have $5 million just sitting there doing nothing, it makes total sense for you to just pay off their loan. It would barely even make a dent in your account, and it would take so much stress off our parents. Family helps family, right? I looked at Peyton. I looked at my parents, who were both staring at me with desperate, hopeful eyes. They actually expected me to do it. They had ignored me for 2 decades, handed my sister a fortune, given me a $10 insult book, and now they expected me to become their personal automated teller machine. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Are you completely out of your minds? I asked, my voice rising in volume. I am not giving you a single dime. Victor frowned, his face turning red. Riley, do not be selfish. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You raised me to be invisible, I fired back, my anger finally breaking through the cold facade. You paid for Peyton's luxury life, while I scrubbed cafeteria floors at 4 in the morning to pay for my own servers. I built my empire completely alone. You do not get to ignore the foundation and then demand a key to the penthouse. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase. I turned around and walked straight toward the front door. Riley, wait. Diana screamed, running after me into the hallway. You cannot just drop a bomb like this and leave. We need to discuss this. We need your help. I opened the heavy wooden front door. A sleek black private car was idling at the end of the driveway, waiting to take me back to Boston. I turned back to look at them one last time. They were standing in the hallway, looking like panicked strangers. "Keep the budgeting book," I said smoothly. "It looks like you are going to need it a lot more than I do." I walked out the door, climbed into the back of the car, and told the driver to go. As the car pulled away from my childhood home, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and completely powered it down. I watched the screen go black. I leaned my head back against the luxurious leather seat and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 22 years. The drive back to Massachusetts was the most peaceful journey of my entire life. No anxious thoughts. No bitter memories. Just the quiet hum of the engine and the beautiful reality of total freedom. I spent my first night in the Cambridge penthouse unpacking my bags, ordering incredibly expensive sushi takeout, and drinking a glass of sparkling water on my private balcony. I did not turn my phone back on until the next morning. When the screen finally lit up, the device immediately started vibrating like a jackhammer. The notifications flooded in so fast the system almost crashed. I had 27 missed calls. I had dozens of text messages from Victor, Diana, and Peyton. But it was not just them. The flying monkeys had been deployed. I had messages from Aunt Judy, Uncle Robert, and cousins I had not spoken to in a decade. My parents had apparently spent the entire evening calling every relative in our family tree, crying about how I had secretly become a millionaire and was now cruelly refusing to save the family from financial ruin. The text messages ranged from desperate guilt trips to outright verbal abuse. Peyton wrote, "You are a greedy, selfish monster. Mom is crying uncontrollably. You owe us this money." Victor wrote, "We are incredibly disappointed in your lack of loyalty. Call me immediately so we can arrange a wire transfer." I sat at my massive marble kitchen island, reading through the venomous messages. I did not feel sad. I felt validated. This massive digital tantrum proved exactly what I had known all along. They did not love me. They only loved what I could do for them. With a calm, steady hand, I went through my contact list. I blocked Peyton. I blocked Victor. I blocked Diana. I blocked every single relative who had sent me a harassing message. The next week, I started my new job at Nexus Tech. The environment was incredible. My new colleagues were brilliant, driven, and respectful. On my second day, I was partnered with a senior developer named Clara. Clara was sharp, funny, and treated me like an absolute equal. When my manager reviewed the code architecture I had built for my previous app, she praised me in front of the entire department. For the very first time in my life, I existed in a space where my talents were actually recognized and celebrated. I started hosting Friday night dinners at my penthouse for my new team. We would eat pizza, play video games, and talk about software development until midnight. I was finally building a real family. A family chosen by mutual respect, not forced by blood and obligation. 9 months passed since the explosive breakfast. 9 months of absolute radio silence from my toxic family, and 9 months of incredible peace and professional growth for me. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while I was writing code at my desk, my phone rang. It was Aunt Vivian. She was the only relative I had not blocked because she was the only one who had never asked me for a single dollar. I picked up the call. "Hey, Aunt Vivian," I said warmly. "How are you doing?" "I am doing well, Riley," she replied, her voice carrying a heavy sigh. "But I thought you should hear the news from me before it hits the grapevine. Peyton's boutique marketing agency officially filed for bankruptcy this morning." She completely folded. I stopped typing and leaned back in my ergonomic chair. "I cannot say I am surprised." "What happened?" Aunt Vivian let out a dry, humorless laugh. "What do you think happened?" She blew through the entire $250,000 in less than 6 months. She rented a massive downtown office she did not need. She bought custom imported Italian leather furniture. She threw lavish networking parties with expensive catering. But she never actually did any marketing work. She did not know how. When the money ran out, she tried to take out more loans, but the banks laughed at her. She had to break the commercial lease, and she is being sued for the remaining balance. And my parents? I asked quietly. They are drowning, Riley. Because they leveraged the house for her initial funding, they are now facing severe financial penalties. Victor had to come out of retirement and take a part-time job just to cover the massive mortgage payments. Peyton moved back into her childhood bedroom and refuses to work. It is an absolute disaster over there. We talked for a little while longer before hanging up. I sat in my office, looking out at the rain. I did not feel a sense of triumphant joy. I just felt a quiet, heavy pity. Later that same evening, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered it. Riley? It was Diana. Her voice was incredibly small, shaking, and devoid of her usual arrogance. Please do not hang up. I borrowed a friend's phone to call you. What do you want, Mom? I asked, my voice completely flat. I wanted to apologize, she sobbed into the receiver. Everything is falling apart. Your father is working night shifts. Peyton will not leave her room. I have been thinking a lot about the past. About how we treated you. We were so blinded by Peyton's big talk that we completely ignored actual hard work. I am so sorry, Riley. We made a terrible mistake. I listened to her cry. I knew exactly what she was doing. It was a half-hearted apology wrapped around a desperate, unspoken plea for a financial bailout. She was hoping I would hear her tears and write a check to save the house. Mom, I said softly. I accept your apology. I really do. But I am not paying off your debt. The choices you and Dad made were your own. You gambled everything on the golden child and you lost. I cannot fix that for you. But Riley, we could lose the house. She cried out, the panic breaking through. Then you will have to learn how to budget, I replied. I hear there are some great beginner books out there. I hung up the phone and blocked the unknown number. I walked out onto my penthouse balcony and looked over the glowing skyline of the city. I realized I was finally completely healed. I had survived the shadow of the golden child, built my own empire, and walked away entirely unscathed. So, am I the jerk for letting my sister's business fail and cutting off my family financially when I have $5 million? Or did they get exactly what they deserved after years of treating me like I was invisible? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.